One of the most praised characters in the Rings of Power was Adar, who seems to be an early elf who was corrupted by Morgoth, and is either a literal or at least a figurative father for the orcs. Although his intentions are noble in a way, he has no qualms about committing horrifically evil deeds. So that raises the question, were there evil elves in Tolkien's legendarium? If your only exposure to Middle-earth is the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, you might assume that the answer is no. In those two settings, elves are pretty much overwhelmingly good, although not so much in the eyes of the dwarves. Still, in those two books, we only really encounter elves that embody good virtues. Rather amusingly, perhaps the most flawed named elf that we encounter is Galeon, Thranduil's butler who neglects his duty by getting himself drunk. However, if you've read the Silmarillion, then you would know that elves can be downright awful. Perhaps the most famous example is Feanor. His apologists might disagree, but Feanor was responsible for some horrific acts. The most notable was the kinslaying at Alcalonde, where the Noldor began fighting the Teleri, killing many of them and stealing their ships. Although you could definitely argue that Feanor did not intend for things to escalate that way, he quickly doubled down by abandoning his half-brother and many of his people in the wastes of Araman, and burning the ships at Losgar for no other reason than spite. Of course, this did not end with Feanor. His 7 sons were also responsible for some very heinous acts, the obvious two being the second kinslaying at Doriath and the third kinslaying at the Havens of Sirion. Celegorm and Curufin were particularly nasty. They were partially responsible for the death of King Finrod Felagund of Nargothrond. They kidnapped Luthien in an attempt to blackmail King Thingol, and almost plunged Nargothrond and Doriath into a war. Celegorm's servants were also responsible for one of the worst crimes of the First Age, abandoning the 6-year-old twin sons of Dior, Elored and Elorin, to die in the forest. Feanor, his sons, and their followers were not the only elves with black marks against their name. In fact, many other elves of the First Age were also deeply flawed. Perhaps the most well-known was King Thingol of Doriath, one of their greatest rivals, who was also a bit of a dick and repeatedly let his personal opinions get in the way of the greater good. Although it would be unfair to say that Thingol was evil or did any evil, he certainly could have done a lot more to help stop it. There is also Eol, the Dark Elf, a strange, reclusive elf who dwelt alone in the forest of Nan Elmoth. Eol enters the history books when he encounters Aradel, daughter of Fingolfin, near the borders of his land. He uses magic to enchant her and takes her for his wife, and they have a son, Maeglin. Many years later, Aradel and Maeglin leave. Eol is none too happy with this, so he pursues them, and all three arrive in Gondolin. Not allowed to leave, Eol must choose to stay or die. He chooses death for both him and Maeglin, and tries to kill Maeglin with a javelin. Aradel takes the hit in the shoulder, but later dies because the javelin is poisoned. Eol is then executed. Another lesser-known individual is Seiros. I actually did a whole video dedicated to him. He was an elf in Thingol's court who insulted Turin and was then humiliated after Turin threw a goblet at him. The next day, Seiros ambushes Turin in the woods, seemingly intent on killing him, but Turin is the far superior warrior, Seiros is disarmed, and a series of unfortunate events then leads to Seiros' rather humiliating death. Now, while all these elves I just mentioned were either directly or indirectly responsible for evil, sometimes of great magnitude, one thing they had in common was that none of them actually served evil, evil being Morgoth or his successor Sauron. For example, the Feanorians were Morgoth's greatest enemies, and the fact that they ended up doing so much to instead further his cause is one of the greatest ironies of the First Age. In fact, Tolkien outright states that no elves willingly served evil, or in any case, no elf rejected Iluvatar as the One. But the clue is in the wording. No elf willingly served Morgoth, as in, no elf willingly offered themselves up to Morgoth's service, but some elves did, unwillingly. The first elves who ended up serving Morgoth were those who would become the first orcs. Now keep in mind, Tolkien wrote many origins for the orcs, and while the elven origin is the most well-known one, it is one that Tolkien moved away from in his later years. If we treat it as canon, these elves were captured, twisted, and corrupted so badly that they would become orcs, so broken and full of self-loathing that they had no choice but to serve the darkness. This is the basis for the character of Adar, and honestly, I'm glad it's a concept that is being explored. However, these were not the only elves that were made to serve the darkness. Throughout the First Age, Morgoth would specifically bid his servants to capture any elves that they could. These elves would serve mostly as slaves, some in the mines, and some as craftsmen, but some were broken so badly that they would end up serving Morgoth as spies. In some cases, Morgoth needed only to look upon them to actually break them. These elves would be intentionally released back into Beleriand, where they would spy on their kinsmen and report back to Morgoth. Some of these elves were uncovered, and this led to a horrible cycle of where elves would legitimately escape Angband, would be shunned by their own kinsmen, and having nowhere to go, would eventually end up back in Angband. And in some cases, elves would not serve evil in life, but would serve it in death. Some elves who died would reject the call of Mandos, choosing to stay in Middle-earth as impotent spirits. These were mostly Avari, who never wished to leave Middle-earth in the first place. It's said that some of these spirits would accept a counter-call, that into darkness, and many of them would end up serving either Morgoth or Sauron at one point or another. As I've covered in several of my other videos, it's likely places such as the Barrow Downs or the Dead Marshes were actually haunted by the spirits of dead elves, enslaved in service of darkness. But these three groups all have something in common. They were enslaved or broken. As I stated earlier, none of them willingly sought out evil. However, there is one individual who is in something of a grey area, and if you've read the Silmarillion, you will know exactly who I'm talking about. Maeglin. Maeglin was the son of the aforementioned Eol. He had evil in his heart from the very beginning, desiring his cousin, and putting those selfish desires above the people of Gondolin. On one such occasion, Maeglin broke King Turgon's ban by mining outside the Akoriath, the encircling mountains which kept Gondolin hidden, and was captured by Morgoth's servants. What happens next differs. In one version of the story, Maeglin betrays Gondolin after being threatened with torture, and in the other, he willingly gives up its location. He is promised Gondolin and Idril, Turgon's daughter, as a reward that Morgoth never intended on handing out. Whether he was coerced or not, or tortured or not, Maeglin's true treachery comes when he returns to the city and does not warn them of Morgoth's impending attack. When the attack commences, Maeglin goes after Idril, and he seems intent on killing Tuor and Idril's young son, the legendary Earendil. He is only stopped when Tuor arrives, kicks his ass, and proceeds to yeet him from the walls of Gondolin, killing him. Much like Feanor, whether his first evil act was an accident or not, Maeglin was fully prepared to double down on evil. So while Maeglin did not intentionally seek out Morgoth, he was more than happy to collaborate with him due to his own selfish desires. So that brings us back to the original question. Were there evil elves in Tolkien's legendarium? Sort of. Elves could undoubtedly commit evil, and some of them carried great evil in their heart, but apart from the grey area of Maeglin, no elf willingly served evil. Those that did were either broken or enslaved, often the same thing. This is no better encapsulated than in the description of the War of the Last Alliance. Beings from all races, creatures, and birds fought on the side of the Last Alliance and Sauron in that war, except for the elves, who exclusively fought against Sauron. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I think a lot of casual fans of The Lord of the Rings get the impression that Tolkien's elves are solely good, virtuous beings, but many of us know that is not the case. If you are a casual fan, I hope this helps you, and also read the Silmarillion. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Feanor did nothing wrong, except for all the times that he did do something wrong.